You see the headlines every single day. Is the economy booming? Is inflation getting out of hand? Well, today, we're going to pop the hood and look at the actual engine that drives all of it. And it really comes down to two massive opposing forces: aggregate demand and aggregate supply. I mean, these are the big questions, right? It can feel like the economy has a mind of its own, with these wild, unpredictable cycles of growth and recession. But what if I told you it's not random at all? There's actually a really powerful and surprisingly simple model that explains these ups and downs. And by the end of this, you'll have the key to understanding exactly why it all happens. So to get the whole picture, we have to start with one half of the equation: the buyers. And that means all the buyers. We're talking about you, me, businesses buying equipment, even the government spending money. All of that spending put together is what economists call aggregate demand. And here it is, in picture form, the aggregate demand curve, or AD for short. Now, this graph answers a pretty simple question. As the average price of, well, everything goes up or down, how does that change the total amount of stuff we're all willing to buy? And you can see it makes intuitive sense. When prices are high, we buy less. When prices are low, we buy more. But why is that? And that really is the key question, isn't it? Your first instinct is probably, well, duh, things are more expensive. But it's actually a little deeper than that. Remember, we're not just talking about your morning coffee getting pricier. We're talking about the average price of everything in the entire economy rising at once. What does that actually do to the way we all behave? It's this fascinating chain reaction. Okay, so it all kicks off with step one: prices across the board go up. That immediately triggers step two, something called the wealth effect. Think about your savings account. The number in there is the same, but its purchasing power has just dropped. It can't buy as much as it could yesterday. So naturally, people feel a little bit poorer and they cut back on spending. At the very same time, step three is happening: the net export effect. Our country's products are now more expensive for people in other countries, so they buy less from us and our exports fall. Put it all together and you get step four: less spending at home and less spending from abroad means our total economic output has to fall. Now here's a super important point to lock in. When the overall price level changes, we're not drawing a whole new curve. We are just moving from one spot to another on the curve we already have. This might seem like a small detail, but you'll see in a minute why this is absolutely critical when we start talking about economic shocks. Okay, so that's the buyer's side of the story. We've got that down. Now let's flip the coin and look at the other side, the producers. We're talking about all the businesses, the factories, the companies actually making all the stuff we want to buy. This is aggregate supply. And here is its counterpart, the aggregate supply, or AS curve. This shows us the total amount of output the entire economy is willing and able to produce at different price levels. And you'll notice right away, unlike the demand curve, this one slopes upward. And there's a really good practical reason for that. Just put yourself in the shoes of a business owner for a second. If you want to seriously ramp up production, what do you have to do? Well, you probably have to pay your best workers overtime. Maybe you have to hire some new folks who aren't as experienced. You might even have to fire up that old, inefficient piece of machinery you keep in the back. All of those things mean it costs you more to make each extra item. So to make it worth their while, firms need the promise of a higher selling price to justify producing more. And this curve tells a really important story about the economy's limits. See how it gets steeper and steeper the further to the right you go? That shows us that as we get closer to our maximum potential output, it gets a lot harder to squeeze out just a little more production. It's like trying to get that last little bit of toothpaste out of the tube. Pushing past this point doesn't get you much more stuff. It just gets you rapidly rising prices. In other words, inflation. All right, now for the grand finale. This is the moment we've been building towards. We have our downward sloping demand curve and our upward sloping supply curve. So what happens when we put them on the same graph? This is where we see the economy in action. This is what causes those booms and busts. That point right there, where the two curves cross, has a special name: macroeconomic equilibrium. You can just think of it as the economy's sweet spot. At that exact price level and that exact output level, the total amount of stuff people want to buy is a perfect match for the total amount of stuff firms want to sell. Everyone's happy. The market is cleared. But let's be real. The economy never just sits still in that sweet spot for very long, does it? Things happen. Big events that cause one of these entire curves to shift are called shocks. And it's these shocks that violently knock the economy out of its equilibrium and cause all the real-world changes we feel in our wallets. So these shocks basically come in two main flavors. On one hand, you have demand shocks. These are all about big changes in spending. Think about the government sending out stimulus checks or a huge, sudden drop in consumer confidence. Then you got supply shocks. These are all about changes in the cost of doing business, like a massive spike in oil prices. And here is the absolute key difference. With a demand shock, price and output move in the same direction. With a supply shock, they move in opposite directions. Okay, let's make this real. Let's walk through an example. Imagine everyone just wakes up one morning feeling incredibly optimistic about the future. They feel secure in their jobs, they think things are heading in the right direction, so they start spending more on cars, vacations, home renovations, you name it. What does that do to our model? Well, all that new spending literally pushes the entire aggregate demand curve over to the right. See, at every single price level, people now want to buy more stuff. This gives us a new equilibrium point. And what's the result? Well, it's kind of good news, bad news. The good news is the economy produces more. We're in an economic boom. But the bad news is that all that extra demand bids up prices. The new equilibrium point is higher, which means we get inflation. Okay, now let's look at a totally different and much scarier scenario. Imagine an event that suddenly makes it way more expensive for every business to operate. For example, a massive, unexpected spike in the price of energy or oil that affects the entire supply chain. How does that shake out? This is what's known as a negative supply shock, and it's the one that everyone dreads. It shifts the whole aggregate supply curve to the left, which means it's now more expensive to produce anything. And this leads to a uniquely painful outcome. The economy actually produces less, which means a recession and job losses. But at the exact same time, the overall price level goes up. This toxic combination, a stagnant economy with rising prices, is called stagflation, and it is an absolute nightmare for policymakers because the tools you use to fight a recession can make inflation even worse and vice versa. And that right there is the central lesson of this whole model. If you remember one thing, let it be this. No matter what kind of shock hits the system, its effect is always split. It's a tug of war between a change in how much stuff we produce, our GDP, and a change in the prices we all have to pay. And the steeper that supply curve gets, the more of that shock gets channeled into higher prices instead of more output. So there you have it. That's the engine of the macroeconomy. Now, the next time you hear a news report about consumer confidence falling or oil prices spiking, you can actually picture these curves shifting around, creating the booms, the recessions, and the inflation we all live through. Which, of course, leaves us with one final, massive question. If these are the powerful forces pushing and pulling our economy, can anyone actually do anything to manage them? Well, understanding this model is the very first step to answering that. Thanks for joining me.